All right, so our next speaker is Nick Bisciotti. I may have butchered your last name there. Sorry. He is a solution architect at Timlin Enterprises, and he specializes in productivity, data management, and analytics. Take it away.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everybody. My name is Nick. Welcome to Service Definition Steering Committee and Key Decision Process for Microsoft 365. My name is pronounced Bisciotti, in case anybody wants to know that. My background is both technical and project management. I've been in IT for about 20 years, was an in-house IT director for a while. I've been consulting on and off since 2006. Been working within SharePoint world since the 2001 version of the product. I currently work primarily in life sciences industry with Timlin Enterprises, and I act as an engagement manager or a project manager or an architect on most engagements that we have. My contact information is in the upper right in case you want to connect. This session is, the description is really about some ideas. I see common patterns in the field, and I just wanted to share some of the lessons learned and offer some suggestions. It's really going to be helpful if you're building a Microsoft 365 program organization, or if you're just trying to find the next way to improve operating model that you have with Microsoft 365 in-house. If you're a consultant, you may be able to take away some ideas or thought patterns from the session. It's going to be mostly ideas. There's a couple Microsoft Teams demonstrations in here, but it's primarily concept and idea-based presentation. So the audience, this could appeal to a broad audience, I would imagine, whether you're an IT director, a project manager, a consultant, architect, you may be able to take away something from here, hopefully. As we go through the material, I hope that you'll find value in defining what I call IT services and related solutions. Hope to provoke thought around steering committee and key decision process. And then at the end, we'll tie everything together and talk about how to really optimize the Microsoft 365 program and within an organization. So some common challenges that I see regularly in the field. Often there's confusion around IT organizational roles and responsibilities. I see a lot of personnel tension about who's doing what or who should be doing what. I see inconsistent use of Teams and SharePoint across user communities within an organization. Of course, everybody can relate to sprawl and the expensive migration or corrective projects related to fixing sprawl situations. There's a lot of rework, a lot of repeat development, security vulnerabilities, and IT tends to get backlogged often when things aren't running optimally. None of these are wholly technology problems, so hopefully we can look at this holistically. So the first section of this presentation is really focused on IT service definition. And what I mean by that is business capabilities that the IT departments are offering to their end users, their customers. IT services are intended to be technology agnostic. And although we often get into the routine of putting everything in terms of Teams or SharePoint or the technology that we're using, I really want to shift the mindset and focus on IT services more generally. at least in this part of the presentation. So many technologies might support an IT service, and those technologies may or may not be Microsoft technologies. And the IT service can be composed of many unique solutions addressing different use cases. So a few questions to think about, and if you're welcome to post messages in the chat and look through those messages. But in your environment, how do end users interact with IT? Do they submit requests to the help desk to get an IT solution, or is the environment self-service driven? Do they create their own solutions? Are they trained? And what are some cases for and against end user self-service and users generating pure vanilla Teams or SharePoint sites? And what things does IT do for departments to make sure that they're not purchasing separate technologies that might already be met with Microsoft 365 with some help? So think about that, and if you want to share your thoughts, maybe we could come back at the end afterwards and do a recap. But I think the first step in really designing a Microsoft 365 program or reinventing one is to define what IT services are being provided to the end users. And it sounds very simplistic, but you would be surprised how many places I've been that have not done this exercise. So I'll give you an example. An intranet as a service, right? That's very different than, let's say, knowledge management tools as a service. And in some environments, we might refer to SharePoint. And SharePoint is both things. It's an intranet and it's a knowledge management tool. And when we're talking about SharePoint, the context in which we're talking about it is important, because if we're setting up an intranet site, the guidelines are going to be different. Those are publishing sites meant for the whole company to consume, and few producers and many consumers. The look and feel, the layout, the security model, the navigation, everything is different in an intranet communication site than it is in a knowledge management site, especially one that is targeted towards a private group or audience. And it gets even more specialized and unique when we use SharePoint for collaboration and process management. So I think the first exercise is to go through the IT services and determine what services are we actually trying to provide to our end users, and which technologies are going to fit well. I go to many companies that have other tools for file sharing besides SharePoint and OneDrive. I see Box, Ignite, Citrix, ShareFile, Dropbox all the time. That doesn't mean that the company's not going to use SharePoint for intranet, or that Teams isn't the right solution for setting up IT projects and managing IT project information. It just means that for them, that was the right solution, whether it's a cost decision or a functionality or some political reason. But if we go through and we define the underlying services first, and then we decide which technologies we're going to use to support them, then we can fully define each service and the guidelines. And I see all the time companies trying to define governance guidelines top down and setting up security rules top down, and they go around in a circle. They try to do it and they can't do it, because what happens is they try to set guidelines for SharePoint, and then guess what? SharePoint's an intranet, but SharePoint's also where we go to manage business processes online. And the rules and the guidelines are different. Our SharePoint sites for knowledge management are going to have external sharing settings that are different than a SharePoint site that's been designed for specifically for file sharing. The SharePoint policies, the underlying Office 365 group policies are all going to be different across these services. So I like to encourage to define these services first, then map the technologies, and design these services one at a time, defining the guidelines. You come back later and integrate those across the organization. The next thing is, within each service, there's the idea of solutions. So, for example, if we're offering program and project management tools as a service from IT, one of the specific tools we might be offering, specific solution, is an IT project management solution that consists of a team, a SharePoint site, a group, and some Power BI reports. A SharePoint site by itself is not going to meet the needs of an IT project, so we need to combine many technologies together and form a solution. And hopefully that solution can be done in a way where it's templated and consistent, and that we can repeat it across many IT projects. In some organizations, maybe a SharePoint site by itself with a corresponding Office 365 group would be sufficient for each project. Other organizations, maybe they need more tools like you see here. But the point is that solutions would be designed and mapped to the corresponding services. And the guidelines, the governance rules, the security parameters, the compliance guidelines, the retention and lifecycle guidelines should be done at the solution level first, not at the platform level, not at SharePoint Online, or not at Office 365 as a whole, because then these things are going to vary between solutions and between services, and you're going to go around in a circle. So step one, map out the IT service, the list, and then dive into each service and map out which solutions make up that service. And you might find gaps, or you might find things that you're doing that are kind of mixed together. And that's okay, you can unravel that. So questions for you, more chat conversation if you like. Do you currently have a project roadmap today for your Microsoft 365 program at large? Do you currently prioritize your Office 365 projects? And if so, how do you do that? How do you decide what project is important to take on next? How do you decide that resources should be focusing on project A versus project B? How do you do that effectively and make sure that you're moving in the best direction for your group and for the company and so forth? Any conversation you want to have about that in the chat, that would be interesting to hear about. We'll talk about the roadmap in just a second. So again, here's an example of a solution that's been categorized by an IT service. So within the collaboration and process tools IT service, we might have 4 different IT solutions. We might have a solution that's meant for a business process, for example, invoicing or recruiting or something of that nature. We might have a IT solution for when a private department needs to collaborate amongst itself. Maybe that's a Microsoft team with a SharePoint site with a group, or maybe that's just a SharePoint site with a group. We might offer an ad hoc work group, just an Office 365 group. That might be a solution. Or we might have a predefined solution for a recurrent meeting or something like this. One example is in life sciences, there's regulatory submissions. Those get structured in a way where documents get organized and people work according to a timeline. So in this case, if I was working in a pharmaceutical company, I might design an IT solution based on the regulatory submission use case, and that would be part of the overall IT service that we call collaboration and process management tools. So we go high level as service, then we go solution, and then we have templates, and we define what those solutions are, And we define the security settings, we define the functionality, the layout of the sites, all the characteristics of the sites. Right? And then the beauty is that the solutions can then be templated because we've based these on use cases and we base these on real needs that are hopefully repeatable. So here's an example of another collaboration service solution that's called an IT project solution, where it's a combination of a Microsoft team that's designed for project management. You can see you have risks and work items. It's a very simplified version. The real ones I use have a lot more channels in them. You can see the Microsoft team has a prefix PRJT, standing for project, and you can see that in this environment there's PGRM standing for program. So now we have consistent prefix and naming. We have different icons to indicate what type of team we're using, and every project team has the same set of channels and structure. And the SharePoint site corresponding to that team is structured in the same way with a dashboard on the home page and links to the work list or the decision log and the other tools. So now here we can go from IT service. Now we have some real solutions that now can be templated and reused. So that, you know, one of the problems I see a lot is that when organizations want to provide collaboration tools, they make the end user start from scratch every single time. They get a vanilla SharePoint site that's got nothing configured. The security settings aren't right, the policy settings aren't right, and it takes a lot of work and it takes skill to actually configure something. And then how is anybody going to have a consistent experience if the end user is doing all that work? In some cases, I see IT doing it, but is IT doing it consistently? Not if they haven't thought it through yet. Most cases, they've gotten maybe a little bit of the way there. Maybe they define communication site versus team site as a first step, and that's a great first step. But there's a lot more that can be done to make the environment very meaningful. So then once we get into templates, we get into provisioning. So in this case, we're talking about more of a IT-based provisioning model as opposed to self-service. But from an end user, I just wrote this up as a user story. As a project manager, I need a collaboration tool for my project so that my team can collaborate. Now, in our help desk system, or whatever mechanism we're using to collect end user demands from our end user community, it could be a SharePoint list that we're collecting this information. We ask the right questions for the end user. We don't ask them what site do you want, because they're not going to prescribe themselves a solution correctly. We need to help them with that. So let's ask them the right questions in their language. Let's ask them, who do they need to share and collaborate with? Do they expect external guests? Okay, if that's yes, then we know that we need to gather some information about where those guests are, what domains they might have email addresses for. So you can see that the design of the IT service goes to solution. Now this is reaching all the way into the help desk system or the demand management system and process. And doing it this way provides an end-to-end experience for the end user. They're explaining what they need in their language, and it's being mapped to the correct solution. IT may be able to approve or realign the request as it comes in and redirect it to the right solution if something got answered in a different way than expected. And then they can kick off a provisioning process and hand off the end result to the owner. This is far more efficient and productive than making the end user build a vanilla SharePoint site from scratch and try to figure out how to set up site columns and lists and so forth. Why do that a gazillion times when you could do it once and template it? Okay. So the next section is steering committee. So the first section was really about establishing your IT services, your solutions, your IT engagement model. And now it's time that you have a steering committee to keep this going forward on a recurring basis. So you need to have a facilitator. You need to identify who decision owners are, who's going to be advisors and stakeholders in this program that we call Microsoft 365 or whatever it's called. And we can set up recurring meeting with a standard format with some agenda topics and give this group of people the processes they need to steer the ship and take in their considerations, their perspectives, so that the IT services can be defined and redefined and adjusted, and the solutions can be defined and adjusted, and that decisions can be made effectively in a timely manner. So questions for you. In your environment, how are people organized around Microsoft 365? Do you have a project-based structure? Does the PMO run the projects? Is there an architectural review board? Who does the steering and vision for the program or the set of projects? Is there like a shared common vision for where you're going with the environment and the services and the solution? And who prioritizes the projects? Do the business stakeholders actually get to say what's prioritized, or does IT handle that? And are resources controlled by the same group that actually sets the vision? So if somebody's setting a vision but they don't control resources, there might be a challenge to move ahead, right? I'm just curious. Any insight you have in the chat would be helpful. So the idea of the steering committee is to bring the right people together on a regular basis and steer the ship. And one of the foundational concepts here is that you want to get a 360-degree view of the decisions being made, particularly around defining the IT services at first and the solution, and then moving into prioritizing projects and developing a project roadmap. So if you think from all these different perspectives as you're defining an IT service, you're going to get a nice set of decision points to work through. And it's less likely that if you have the right people and you have the right perspectives, that you're going to have to do rework. It's more likely that the progress you make will be sure-footed and you'll be able to move forward without having to rework it later. You know, what happens is if you work in a silo or you work and you make progress in one area, you know, if you're not involving the right people, it tends to overturn some of the decisions, or you have to reevaluate or reassess, and that will slow you down. So if you look at the IT service definition, the architecture, what are related projects? What are related processes? Like if we're defining an IT service, what's the, like I said, IT engagement model? How do end users submit demand? How are you going to provide tech support? Are they going to call in a phone number? Are they going to submit an email? Is there a system for this? What's the SLA? The SLA on a intranet request may be a lot less of a priority with a much longer SLA than a mission critical collaboration request. So why would you define an SLA at the SharePoint level or the system level when you have different operating activities going on within different aspects, different services? It doesn't make any sense. So map out the services and then define the SLAs for tech support that way. Same thing with disaster recovery and anything compliance related too. Retention, right? That's going to vary by use case and by solution. what IT resources are required to maintain this service and this set of solutions? Do I need an architect available? Do I need a developer available every time somebody requests a new IT project site or solution? It could be possible. Do I need to provide ongoing training and risk management? So if you take all these different points of view with the steering committee and you collect their feedback and what they need out of the process, it will provide a good direction and a good way to move ahead. As you get the feedback and you begin to prioritize the activities in the program, you'll see that there's naturally a current state. There's going to be risks and challenges and gaps that are revealed, many that you know about, some you are learning about. And then you get to envision with the steering committee the future state. What are your biggest opportunities? How do you help the company meet its objectives and goals with Microsoft 365? And what's the future state that we're moving towards? And then the project roadmap that you develop is going to be a prioritized list of projects that will get you from point A to point B. And it will be balanced, and it will be it will hold a lot of water, because when it was developed, it would have had the right involvement from the right people. Okay. The project roadmap bridges the gap between the current and the future state. One tool I use to help with the steering committee activities is I use Microsoft Teams, and I'll set up a program level team, and then I'll set up a list in SharePoint for tracking agenda topics that want to be discussed across the team. This way I don't have to remember. I let people put their topics of interest in the list, and then I review those and try to align those with the meetings that are going to happen, and address those questions that get asked in the agenda topic list. But centralizing agenda topics sounds like a basic thing, but it's actually very effective. And it gives people one place to reference. You don't have to go digging through emails to find out what that topic was that you wanted to remember. It's all there in one place. So if you're creating a list, you might capture some basic fields like, what's the topic? What's the status? Have you discussed the topic yet? Is it closed out? And what's the target date? What meeting do you want to try to talk about this topic? Okay, so that's a basic suggestion that I've found to be pretty useful. The next suggestion really has to do with key decision process. So the key decision process is really important. It can work without a steering committee. It works better with one. But I view this as one of the top 3 things to do to set up or to revitalize a Microsoft 365 program. So you want to be able to identify what decision points are when you're defining these services and the solutions. Do it from a bottom-up approach at first. Use the steering committee to gather feedback about the decision point. Hear everybody's perspective. Develop well-informed options. Go off and do research if you have to, and document the options and why A versus B. Assign an owner and a due date. And then once the owner makes the decision, capture that rationale for the decision and what the outcome is, and then plan for change and plan to integrate that change into the big picture. So my question for you is, where you work, how are decisions made about the program and the various Microsoft 365 projects you're working? Is there a formal process, or is it really driven by organizational authority and political? And what decision-making challenges have you experienced while you're working on Microsoft 365 projects? So anything you can contribute to the chat, would appreciate it on that. Would like to hear what your experiences are. Okay. The next tool within Microsoft Teams and SharePoint that I use for managing the program is the decision log. So the key decision process is great. We have to capture decisions. While we don't necessarily have to track these online, I found that tracking these in a list is pretty helpful, similar to those agenda topics. I do track decisions at a program level and a project level. This particular example is a project level decision log, but the program level ones are basically the same format. So what I found to work well is identifying the status of a decision. And you'll see that in the statuses, I have open dash or closed dash. And the reason why I do it that way, and I don't just omit the prefix, it's because when I'm creating a list view in SharePoint list, I want to be able to use the contain filter. So I want to have an open view. I'll be able to say anything where the status contains the word open or the status contains the word closed. So if I do it this way, then I can create two views, open and closed, and it works really well. If I omit the prefix, I can't do it that way. So that's the reason for that. But anyway, the status, tracking the status is important. Tracking the options. So you see one of the items in the list, we want to decide on lifecycle retention for OneDrive accounts. And let's see, the options are we can either retain OneDrive accounts after somebody's terminated, we could delete the content, or we can transfer the content to the manager of the person after they've been terminated. And it looks like we're here talking about retaining the content for 7 years. So we're likely either going to do a retain and archive, or we're going to transfer. Now, if anybody in the future wants to go back and look at the decision and the rationale, it's all there in one place. This would probably be a program level decision. And it would be there for reference, and the date would be stamped, and we would be able to tell who made the decision and why. So this has been extremely helpful. Tracking in a list is helpful because going from meeting to meeting, the list is always in one place. It's also helpful to identify roles in the decision-making process. I find the natural roles tend to be an owner, like a person that makes a decision. It's hard to decide who that is sometimes, but it is helpful if you can. Advisors would be people that have a stakeholder in the decision. They would provide their perspectives. Communicators would be responsible for communicating the outcome to either the end user community or the other stakeholders. And the informed people would be those who are receiving information about decisions being made. So if it's just a leadership level decision, the informed might be the leadership team. But if you're changing the design of a service that is being used across the whole company, you might have the whole company be in the informed party list. So mapping it out and structuring the decisions this way is really helpful, I find. And it saves a lot of time going from meeting to meeting. And as you're working through different ideas and talking with people, you can point them to a list. And it's also good to keep everybody on the support team on the same page to what the guidelines are and what the rules are. Because there's not always a consistent communication vehicle to keep the support team in line with the strategic activities happening on the program. So an overview of the process, how it looks using the list. If you log the key decisions as they arise, you can assign an owner and a target date, identify if there's any blockers or dependencies, gather feedback from the steering committee and the stakeholders. Make sure you note their feedback in the list. Detail out the decision options, the pros and cons of each option. If there's license costs or other concerns, resource costs, try to get that level of information into the decision so it's made. Because a lot of times decisions will be made with assumptions or preferences or biases, and they're not clear. And then you come back later and something doesn't make sense. It's good to state the obvious and get it all in there for record keeping. Ask the owner to make a decision and then capture their outcome and their rationale. Then once the decision's made, communicate that to the stakeholders and those who are affected by the change, and then coordinate any related changes to operational processes. So if you decided, for example, as a key decision to change the SLA for, I don't know, a team's help request to 2 hours from 3 hours, there's different people that you'd want to notify. You certainly need to coordinate that with the support team, and they may have to change their process. They may have to say, put different people on staff or change the hours that people work. So you have to think through all those things before you actually implement the change, or at least while you're changing. So finally, integrating and implementing these 3 ideas, the service definition, the steering committee, and the key decision process, how do we tie it all together? I would say that a recap is first we'll set up the Microsoft 365 program and project information in Microsoft Teams, organize a steering committee, and implement a key decision process. Start to develop a project roadmap. We can create a list in the SharePoint site and link it from the team. So start to track and put priority to our list of projects. And we use that during our steering committee meeting. Define IT services. So now we're actually doing the real work. We're sitting down with the team and we're focused on what services are we going to offer and what solutions are we going to map to those services. We're going to do some business analyst work. We're going to analyze the different use cases and the different needs, find common patterns. And we're going to have to treat exceptions as exceptions. And then finally, we implement and integrate these changes throughout the enterprise. And if we've done these things, we're going to have a really good program to work with it, a really good framework. And people are going to be working on the right things that are going to move the program ahead. And the solutions will be of more quality, and they'll be better aligned with the company's strategy and goals, and as well as resources. So what does the end user get out of all this? Well, hopefully they'll get solutions that are aligned with their needs, and they'll get a demand fulfillment process that's streamlined and easy to work with. So for example, they might come into an IT request system and say, I need XYZ. Well, that demand would get routed. The information they provide through the questionnaire would lead to the solution being provisioned, hopefully automatically with templates, and then it would be handed over. So we can also check, are there any training requirements for handing over that solution? We can ask the new owner of the solution to fulfill their training obligations. And in the end, they get their demand gets met with the right solution. The process becomes very consistent and efficient. It doesn't cost a lot to deliver these solutions because all the work's been done up front. The IT and end users don't need to develop the solutions manually anymore from those vanilla templates. They get a nice, rich, featured solution. Although some may not like that because they like to play and they like to learn and that's okay. You might have to address that differently, give them a sandbox or something. The solution can be made secure. So when you template something, it's going to force you to think through what are all the different security configurations in groups, in SharePoint site, in Teams, and make sure all three are aligned with each other and that they're set up appropriately for whatever solution template you're creating. All too often I see that totally overlooked and not even considered, and it's an afterthought. The vanilla site gets spun up, and never again does somebody revisit the security settings, external sharing, whitelisted domains, things like this. And then that leads to a lot of extra unnecessary support demand. When you put the effort up front and you prepay it, then you can avoid a lot of that back-end support. So when you think through too, the other benefit is you're going to fit into an overall enterprise architecture that's been thought out. You can develop a topology diagram and show how the pieces fit together and make it really coherent, not only for the architects and IT, but also for the end users. And what happens is then you'll be able to develop an intranet and design an intranet that provides navigation in a nice way. Because think about it, if you have your solutions defined and you've compartmentalized your environment into different categories of solutions, those, with different naming conventions, the end user experience is going to be wonderful because they're going to be able to navigate throughout the intranet and throughout Teams, and they're going to be able to find things. They're going to know just by seeing a team with a prefix what that is, or they'll be able to navigate to a list of resource center sites in SharePoint because those are all organized consistently and grouped together in the navigation. So that's the end game for the end user. Alternatively, you can proceed on with no IT service definition or no predefined solutions and no steering committee and no decision process. And if you decide to do that, then we don't know what might happen. But in the cases where I've done risk assessment in environments that lack these basic foundational elements, it's a pretty strong case to at least get started on it because of cost avoidance. So by at least putting some energy into IT service definition and predefined solutions, we can greatly avoid sprawl and rework and duplication of teams. If you provide the right solution or the right avenue for somebody to get the right solution, then they're less likely to create 3 Microsoft Teams when they really only need 1. And initially, it's not a lot of pain for somebody to create a team, and it may not take a lot of IT resource consumption to provide a team at first. It's not really the upfront where the cost is. It's really on the back end. It's really later when the team is abandoned or IT's left holding the bag trying to figure out, why do I have all these teams with no owners, or I have owners and they don't use the team anymore. Now what do I do with the content? And I have to analyze the content. And I've been on projects that are several $100,000 deep, and it's all about recovering content or migrating content or reorganizing content. And most of the time it's really difficult to understand that content afterwards, after it's been abandoned. It's really expensive later. And that's something IT needs to drive, because the end user is going to look for immediate fulfillment, but IT really needs to think about their long-term and their responsibilities, because it's going to be their budget that gets whacked when the cleanup effort has to happen. And they're the ones that are going to have to answer for that. So getting a start is really important. With that, I think that's all that I had prepared. Let's see. Yeah, I can show you just briefly a demo. So this is the Microsoft Teams environment, the demo environment I was showing you. So in here, you'll see I have a program team and I have a project roadmap channel. And all I've done here is added a website tab that displays the list of the projects. And I just put this together this morning just to show for this presentation. Now, here's a project team. You could tell because it has a prefix. Notice both of the prefixes are 4 characters long, and there's a hyphen as a delimiter. That's consistent. That makes it easy to view things when you're going up and down. Here you have a department and a resource center. Key decisions looks the same way. It's a list. Okay. If I add a new key decision, it's just a list item. All right. I think that's about it. So we got about 12 minutes left. Okay.
So there are a few comments in the Q&A. So it seems to be different ways that organizations are making their decisions. So the first one that came up was, I'll paraphrase what was being said here, but in their organization, the IT department is focused more on filling out the tickets. So it's less about what can we do to service the customer and more about keeping the lights on, essentially. So they need a better approach at communicating and understanding what the different departments need. And I'm sure you've seen it. This is a pretty common scenario out there.
Yeah, I see that as well. Yeah, it's tough because IT is often behind and trying to keep up, and I see IT departments wanting to get proactive and wanting to help and wanting to spend their time on strategic efforts, but just not having the right processes or resources in place. Usually it's resources. In time, it's unfortunate. Yeah, I see that a lot too.
Yeah. Then the next one is this person says we use decision register lists with fields such as decision, made by, agreed by, group, and date.
That's great.
And then the last one here says decisions made by stakeholders in a project, then escalated if necessary.
Interesting. Okay. Sounds like a natural sort of flow to it. Like, if you're in a project meeting, you kind of work out the decision, and then if you're not sure or if you need someone else's approval, you could escalate that up. Sounds reasonable. And
the person who made the first comment says that it's a problem within government organizations. It hasn't really been a cost factor.
Yeah, I worked in the DoD for 8 years, so I can definitely relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
Low cost, technically acceptable.
Yeah. It's usually about a 10 to 15-second delay. So far, those were all the questions.
Anybody have any thoughts about project roadmaps? Do you use project roadmaps now? How do you prioritize your projects?
No responses just yet. see. We have one from Joe. It says, I love roadmaps. My last job set one up and was still following it when I left 2 years later.
Wow, that's great. Joe, do you do, are the roadmap priorities driven by risks, risk assessment, or are they driven by opportunities? Or both, maybe?
Some modification, shift priorities, but 90% the same as the day we set it up.
Wow.
Opportunities more than risk.
Okay. What's everybody doing for provisioning and the initial end user demand request? Is it using ServiceNow or using SharePoint? How are you gathering demands from the business?
Nothing new.
Does anybody have predefined solution templates in place where you work now? Or are you provisioning the vanilla Teams and SharePoint sites and building up from that point?
No replies.
Okay.
All right. Well, we are getting here to the end of the hour. This room is going to transition into the closeout session in 3 minutes. So, Nick, thanks a lot. Yeah, this is a great presentation. I'm sure people had a lot to take away from this one. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close out?
No, thanks, Jason, for the help and getting set up and all the work you did here. And I look forward to watching the final presentation.
Great. Thank you very much.